Welcome. So it is 2 o'clock and November the 5th, and I'm delighted to host a Northeastern IPM Center Toolbox. We have two wonderful presenters today, and our topic is on new tools for identifying and prioritizing range-shifting invasive plants. We have a lot of people in attendance and signed up, and we're going to be doing a live demonstration of the system during the session. And if you have a species or a state that you'd like us to consider for the live demonstration, please put it in the Q&A feature. And if you don't see that on your screen, if you scroll over in the bottom, you'll see there's a bar. Sometimes it's on the top, and in the middle of the bar, it says Q&A. If you click on there, you can type in your species and state, and there's a little checkbox there that you can do it anonymously if you prefer. And also, since we have quite a lot of people on the line, please use that feature if you'd like to ask questions. It helps us to sort through the questions and see if there's any duplicates. So if you can scroll to the next slide for me, Jenica. I'm Jana Hexter, and I am joined by Jenica Allen and Bethany Bradley. And there we go. Jenica, if you can shift this way. It looks like we're having a little issue with moving the slides forward. That's fine. I can remember what's in those slides. So there is going to be a recording that is available. And it takes about a week for us to have the recording edited and put up. And anybody who's registered for this webinar will get a copy of the recording. I'll send you an email. And as I mentioned, please use the Q&A feature. And we have a poll with some questions for you. And if we can launch the poll, you will see we have about 7 questions, just so we can have a sense of who is on the line and what your level of interest is. And so we can tailor the conversation to you and also give us a good idea of what might change that we can use for evaluating these webinars and make them better. So you have to answer all of the questions, and it's not a real test. They're just questions. So take your best guess, and just, you just choose some. There's no stress about it. And I'm going to give about 2 or 3 minutes for us to do that. And once you've answered them all, your vote will be counted, and then we're going to share the results. So I'll just be quiet while you're having a chance to do that. All right, so we can share the results with you. So it looks like 82% of the people are currently working on invasive plant management or monitoring. So we have an experienced group, and looks like we have quite a lot of researchers and land managers in our crew, but actually pretty varied. It's quite a varied mix there. A small majority currently incorporates climate change into your work in invasive species, but it's close to 50-50. And we have a pretty experienced crowd of information about how aware you are of the potential for invasive species to shift your ranges. And you are currently using online tools to help you identify invasive species. Again, that's close to a 50-50 mix. And then we will go over these questions at the end too, so that you can see if there's any shift. And so it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We have Dr. Jenica Allen, and she is the Campus Living Laboratory Manager at Mount Holyoke College. So welcome, Jenica. And we also have Bethany Bradley. She's an Associate Professor of Biogeography and Invasive Ecology in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Gee, if you have a young child, you should test them on whether they can say that. One long title. So we're just delighted that they've come here to share some results of some work that they've been doing with a small grant from the Northeastern IPM Center. And for any of you who are interested, our deadline for our grant applications is next Friday. So you still have time to get something in if it's something that seems like a good fit for you. And with that, I will hand it over to Jenica. And again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature, which you'll see at the very bottom or top of your screen, a little box, and that helps us keep track of your questions. And you can ask your questions anonymously as well. So, okay, all over to you, Jenica.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for the intro, Jana, and thank you everyone who's online, who's joining us today. We have a really great turnout, so I'm excited to hear what questions that you have throughout our hour today. Quick roadmap of where we're going. We're going to talk briefly about invasive species and climate change, sort of frame the issue that we're talking about today. Then transition specifically to the new tools that both Bethany and myself have been working on. The first of those is looking at range shift maps for individual species. So where in geographic space might we expect currently established invasive species to show up in new places as climate continues to change. Then we'll talk about a tool that actually generates lists of range shifting species for a user specified state or county. And then finally, we'll cap it off with Bethany talking about some ways through impacts assessments that we can prioritize those state, county, and regional lists. So we already did the questions for you, so we're going to skip right past that. And before I really launch into the heart of what we've been working on, I want to acknowledge the fact that none of this work happens in isolation and absolutely relies upon funding from organizations like the Northeastern IPM Center in order to make this work possible. So Bethany and I are the presenters today, but there's a team of folks at EdMaps that have been working really closely with me on some of the mapping and listing components that have public-facing interactive pieces to them. Colleagues at the University of New Hampshire, Jeff Garnis, colleagues at UMass Amherst, Brittany and May, and other partner organizations such as the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, and the Southern IPM Center. So thanks to all of those folks up front. So why are we here? What are we talking about today? Most of us on the line today, according to our poll, are working on invasive species issues in some way. And it often feels like when we're talking about the invasive species issue, we've got plenty to deal with that in and of itself. We don't need the added wrinkles or complexities of climate change. But what we also know is that the most efficient and effective way of dealing with the invasive species problem is very early during the invasion process. So if we can't prevent species from being introduced, then getting to that eradication phase shortly after introduction or after a range expansion is really what we should be targeting if we're trying to make things as efficient as possible. And so if we're thinking about climate change, we know that with changing climate comes new potential ecosystems. I always find this graphic really compelling. So here we've chosen Massachusetts as an example state, but sort of where, if you picked up the climate of Massachusetts, where it's going to resemble moving forward under different emission scenarios. So if we're looking at 2070 to 2099 in the business as usual, sort of the high emissions scenario, we're down in the southeastern United States in terms of what current climates are equivalent. So that's a pretty dramatic shift in what the Massachusetts climate might look like. And what happens is invasive species and species generally are able to respond to those climate changes by shifting their ranges. And so the map that you're looking at here has some black dots on it. those are observations of this species, Ludwiga grandifloria, currently. So these are data that come from databases like EDMAPS that we can build models for based on current climate conditions at those locations, at those observation locations. And so what that helps us to predict is where this particular species could occur now. And so that's the red shaded area of this map. So that's the current potential range. But then we can also project that forward using climate change projections for where we would expect this species to be able to exist under the new climate conditions of mid-century, so 2040 to 2060. And so what you'll notice is a lot of that potential range shifts poleward, northward in the northern hemisphere. And that's a common scenario for lots of species that we could model and have modeled. And so those are the sorts of range shifts that we're talking about today, both at the individual species level, but then also with a focus on geography. So that was an example of a specific species. We also know that there are lots of invasive species in the United States. And so if we consider that there are over 1,000 invasive plants in particular that are regulated in some way, either at the federal level or at the state level, somewhere in the lower 48 states, we can build models for as many of those species for which we have occurrence data. And Bethany and I published a paper in 2016, and this is a map from that paper, looking at how many of the 896 species are projected to shift their ranges in certain directions. And so it's sort of the accumulated gain of invasive plants shifting their range into the upper latitudes and really also up in elevation. And then also in all of the blue shaded areas of the country, places where currently established invasive plants will no longer find suitable habitat. And so all of the work that we're going to talk about today focuses on species that are already established in the United States and have the potential to move around on a map, if you will. And so I can sort of anticipate some questions about sort of what are the new invaders coming in that are not yet established here in the United States somewhere. And we can't answer that question. But what we can do is talk about species that are currently problematic, say in the Northeastern or Southeastern United States, shifting their ranges into the Northeast as an example. And so where all of this connects to me for thinking about invasive species management is that climate change actually offers somewhat of an opportunity to be proactive about invasive species prevention and management. So it allows us to take what we know about what species and what species specifically can shift their ranges and where they can shift their ranges and try to get ahead of those range shifts. And so we've actually come at this problem or opportunity, depending on how you'd like to frame it, in a couple different ways. The first of which is visualizing individual species. And I think if we just stop my share for one moment, we can actually go look at what these maps look like in reality. So, give me one moment to switch over here. Share.
While Jenica is concentrating on that, if you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature. And we do have some question breaks lined up. So, and we will ask those as they come along. All right, perfect. There you go.
All right, so many of you, hopefully anyway, have used the EDMAPS interface. So EDMAPS, it stands for the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. I like to think of them as sort of an invasive species data clearinghouse. So they manage a lot of geographic data pertaining to invasive species. And one of the things that is offered on the EdMaps website are distribution maps. And if you click on distribution maps at the top of their homepage, it brings you to a page that looks something like this, where you get a big long list of species and then some options for different types of maps that you could look at. And so we asked early on, before we started the webinar, if anyone had particular species they were interested in. I'm just going to take the first one off of the list that I've been able to confirm we actually have a model for. So it was golden rain tree. And so the maps that I'm about to show you exist for 896 of the species in EdMaps. We don't have a published list of exactly what those species are that is in EdMaps specifically. So what I would suggest that you do, if you have a species that you are particularly interested in, just search for that species and you'll know very quickly by going to the species page whether we have range shift maps for it or not. So I found golden rain tree, which is the species that I'm looking for, and the range shift maps are available at the county level. So you'd click on county, and these are the distribution maps that you might be most familiar with. So these are observation maps. All of the green shaded counties are places where the EdMaps database has information about that species occurrence in that county. The new tools that are climate change related are these future range and future certainty buttons on the county maps. So future range will bring you to, in this case, a map that looks quite orange. And let me just shrink my screen a little bit so you can see the legend. So the orange colors indicate range expansion. The light purple is range stability. So places where the species has been observed and we expect it to be able to persist there with climate change by mid-century, so 2040 to 2060. The dark purple color, which we don't actually see any on this map, is a range retraction. And so those are places where the species has currently been observed, but is not expected to persist in those locations with climate change. Now, climate change modeling is not so simple as you have a single climate model and it allows you to make ecological predictions. There are actually about 20 different climate models, and we use something called an ensemble modeling approach to take advantage of as many global climate models as possible to make our future ecological predictions. And so the maps that you see on EdMaps actually require user input in order to define expansion, stability, or retraction. And so up in this upper left-hand corner, you'll see that there's a number of models selector, and it defaults to one model. And it allows us to choose how many of the future ecological predictions, so there's 13 different predictions, each of which corresponds to a different climate model. How many of those models have to agree on whether a particular county will have suitable climate for golden rain tree? So this is a very orange map. If we select one model, which means any one of the 13 models predicted potential suitability in each of these orange counties. But if we require more consensus, so let's say we pick 13, we see that we lose some of the counties anyway. It still is a very orange map. So this is a species that has high capacity for further spread with climate change. But we see that this group of counties, for example, up in the northern part of the US, many of those counties sort of drop off as no current observations and also unsuitable with climate change. And they're unsuitable given the requirement that all 13 of our future predictions are required to agree. So the number of models in this consensus idea sometimes can feel confusing in the beginning, but what it really allows users to sort of interact with and make decisions based on their own priorities is whether you want to fall very far on the one extreme of the precautionary principle continuum. So you want to know if any single model has predicted suitability for the species, you would pick one as your number of models. But if you are, let's say, trying to come up with a priority list of species, and so you want to have some higher level of certainty that most of the predictions or all of the predictions that we have suggest that that species will be in your county or in your state, then you would want to choose a much larger number of models, say 11, 12, or 13. And if you're trying to just sort of get a handle on what different selections would mean for the particular species you're interested in, that's where the future certainty button can actually be quite useful. So this future certainty button brings you to a new page that is actually a static map of how many of the 13 climate models suggested that each county was suitable for golden raintree in this case. And so the deeper the green color, the more consensus that there was between models. And we have tooltips on each of the counties. And so it identifies the county, and it also tells you how many models were in agreement that you would find suitability for golden raintree. We have predictions for the 2040 to 2060 time bracket as sort of the more near-term set of climate model predictions that are available for the globe. The longer-term sort of focused on 2100 predictions, that time horizon just feels very far away. And so the objective for this tool is to provide forward-looking, but also sort of intermediate timeline products that would allow planning now for species that are potentially coming your way. So I'm going to stop my share again and go back to our slides. So these are sort of the static versions. And this is our spot where we're going to stop and actually see if our audience has questions that we can answer at this point.
And it actually looks like we don't have any questions at the moment, so we can move ahead. Oh, actually, we just got one in, so I can ask this. Dylan Finley asked, are these models based on different emission scenarios? Is there a way to determine which of those 13 models are in agreement in any given county?
Two really great questions. So the answer to the first question is all of these models are based on the relative concentration pathway 4.5 models. So relative concentration pathways are sort of the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Sorry, I always forget what the acronyms stand for. So the AR5 report, which is the most recent report from the IPCC, which is sort of the international body that aims to synthesize climate change science, both climate modeling and environmental impact on human societies, on ecology, on physical, chemical processes of the earth. As part of that effort, there are sort of emissions scenarios now called relative concentration pathways, or RCPs. And so there's sort of a business as usual RCP. There's sort of an intermediate emissions RCP, which is the RCP 4.5. And then there's sort of the worst case scenario, which is RCP 8.5. And so everything that you see on the EdMaps website is based on projections with the RCP 4.5. And the second part of that question was, can we see which of the 13 models are in agreement for a given county? We don't currently serve that information. Certainly we have that information. That's how all of those consensus numbers get calculated. But we haven't actually included that information in the interface itself. If that's something that is useful and interesting to really anybody who's using this tool, that's helpful feedback for us. And that's actually one of the reasons that webinars like this are so helpful, because we learn what everybody else wants to know that we haven't actually put out there yet. So thanks for the question. And if it's something that is of interest, I'd be sort of curious to get feedback on that from lots of folks. So.
Great. And there's one other question here is, what factors do the climate models incorporate? Just temperature or also precipitation or other factors?
Oh, another really great question. And I should point out that the paper that underlies all of this, sort of the scientific publication, is available through the UMass Scholars Repository. And so I'll show you where you can link to that later in the talk. But to answer the question directly, the models include temperature and precipitation variables. So we've tried to include variables that kind of made sense across lots of different ecoregions in the United States. So we've included things like the minimum temperature in January, since winter temperatures are expected to climb. And in temperate regions, cold winter temperatures are actually really important for the vernalization of woody plants. We've also included things like the maximum temperature in the warmest month, so trying to get at heat extremes. We've included things like annual precipitation to try to characterize general water availability, since we know some places are much drier than others. So we have, done our best anyway to capture the range of climatic variables that we think, based on what we know about plant biology, would be important across a large swath of both species and a large swath of geography.
Great. Well, we have other questions, but I'm going to suggest we move on because we have other question breaks and that we can.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right. So I've spoken thus far about individual species, but I showed you this map early on, which suggests that it's not necessarily just individual species that we might be thinking about, but also the group of species that might show up, or in some cases leave, particular states or counties. And so we've developed a second tool that allows you to generate lists based on a state or county. And I'm going to go to that tool so that we can actually play with it. Okay, so this was our climate certainty map. Now I'm going to switch over to the range expanders listing tool. And so this also resides on the EdMaps website. And I have the text shrunken down a little bit so that we can sort of see everything all on one screen, but I'm going to enlarge it in just a moment so that it's a little bit easier to read. Okay. So we have a short description at the top of the tool, but essentially says the same thing that I just said about the number of models required for consensus for including or excluding a species from a state or county list. Essentially, in this choose number of models option, the larger the number with the maximum of 13, the more consensus that is required among the different predictions in order to put a species on the list for the chosen state or county. And so I asked early on if somebody wanted to offer up a state for us to work with, and New York got a bunch of votes. So we can, in the select a state, go ahead and just select New York. And you'll see that a couple things dynamically change when you make really any new selection. For when we selected New York, we got zoomed out to the US map. instead of being focused on the first state that had been selected. The default for select a county is all of the counties, which means that the list that is returned on the right-hand side of the screen is a state level list. But if we were interested in a specific county, let's just pick Albany County for ease, the list will update to be specific to that county rather than the state as a whole. And I'll circle back to that in just a moment. Let's just focus on states for right now. So New York State, all counties, let's say that we wanted high consensus. And so we're going to say that all 13 models have to agree in order to include a species on the state list. What we see in the list on the right-hand panel is all of the species that are somewhere in the lower 48 states currently that are not yet present in New York State, but according to 13 climate models, could be there by 2040 to 2060, so mid-century. So it's a relatively short list, 12 species. We have the default of this tool set to really no refinement. So I said that this list represents species that are anywhere in the country that have the capacity to exist in New York State with changed climate by mid-century. But let's say we wanted to narrow this list down to species that had been observed in an adjacent state. So let's say that we're interested less in species that might get moved around in, say, horticultural trade, but we want to know about species that perhaps can disperse naturally. So we select species in an adjacent state. And so you'll see that the map updated, and so the adjacent states get highlighted in a light blue color, so you know which states are being considered. And then our list has also updated to some smaller number of species that have been observed in one of the blue highlighted states that are not yet present in New York, but have the potential to be there according to 13 climate models. So any list that gets returned in this right-hand panel has a bunch of hyperlinks on it. We're trying to make it easy for you to learn about species that might not be familiar. Since these are species that aren't in your state yet, we want to make it easy to kind of connect to information. And so the scientific name, if we click on that, it takes us to the species page on EdMaps. Let me just move my controls here. If we click on the species common name, it takes us to the same place. So we're trying to get you to species information by clicking on either the scientific or the common name. And then the map, sort of the little pin icon, will actually circle you back, link you back to the range shift models that we just talked about in the first section. So if we click on that, it takes us to a page with the selectors for the number of models, and then you can play with what that range expansion or contraction looks like for that species. So it gives you a sense of, is this a problem for, some small area of the country? Is this one of those species that is, projected to expand to be all over the country? Helps you start to understand the shifting geography of that specific species, if that's how you want to drill down into the list. All of these lists are also downloadable. So you'll notice there's a little download link here. And if you get load dialog box. And so you can save that list wherever you'd like for future use. The only other thing that I want to point out while we're here, well, really two things. I focused on refining the list by adjacent states, but you have two other options. You could also refine the list by species within a radius. This map is a little bit slower to update, but it will update, so just have a little bit of patience. I promise it will update. And it allows you to use this little slider. So instead of saying just adjacent states, you could make that radius just a little bit bigger to, in the case of New York State, incorporate Maine, for example. And it's being a little bit slower than I would anticipate. So as with any new tools, we are actually keeping track of what's working really well and what things we can still improve in terms of performance. And so our radius tool has been something that we've continued to work on, and it's showing us today we need to keep working on it. You can also refine the list by species that have been observed within a specific ecoregion. And so when you choose the ecoregion option, you get a drop-down list of all of the different ecoregions that are present in the lower 48 states. And it allows you to select whichever you'd like. And the list that is returned are species that are not in your focal state. So in this case, they have not been observed in New York. They have the potential to exist in New York according to 13 climate models by mid-century. And they have been observed somewhere else in the eastern temperate forest ecoregion currently. So it allows you to sort of pull back that species list to sort of ecoregionally similar species. So I am fully aware that that was a lot of information very quickly. So I am going to come back to our PowerPoint and just pause and allow Jana to field questions.
Okay, great. So we do have some questions.
Yep.
Claire Ryan asked, do the range shifting lists and maps update as new data is added to EdMaps?
So excellent question. As of right now, they do not automatically update. And that's because we need to rerun the models every time new data comes in. So the models will get updated periodically. I don't know exactly the frequency of that update right now, since we're just finishing up the tool. That's sort of like the next stage of all of this, is updating all of the models with new data that's coming in. So yes, it's very much on our radar. We very much want this to be as dynamic a tool as possible, such that every time you're going to the tool, you're sort of getting the latest and greatest information. So that's kind of where I'll end it.
Okay, great. So I'm actually conscious of time, and we do have a couple more questions. One, actually, Angela asked how you got to the tool on EdMaps, and someone else asked that same question. So maybe you could quickly show us, if you go to the main EdMap site, how you scroll into that tool, and then maybe we can move on to Bethany's presentation, and we can certainly answer all the questions. But I want to be conscious of moving along. So.
Absolutely. So actually the easiest way to get to the tool is to use the URL directly for the listing tool. And so it's edmaps.org/range shift listing. So that is the easiest way to get there.
Great.
Yep.
All right, wonderful. So Brett and Bethany, you're up next.
Awesome, sounds good. And actually I can answer Caroline's question here, which is that one of the things that Jenica is showing, so the question was that in previous presentations, we had a much larger watch list for New York State of about 100 species, which is part of what I'm about to talk about too. And so in Jenica's demo just now, there were 12. That is largely because of the sort of certainty piece that she was entering in there. So if you play around with that range expanders tool, you can choose the number of models. So if you put the number of models at 13, then you're like absolutely high level of certainty. Every single model projects that that species will be in New York. When we generated the list of 100 species, we had a slightly less, like certain list. So we were down to, I think, maybe 10 models projecting range shifts. Is that right, Jenica?
It was 10 or 11. I'd actually have to go back and look at our code to remember with absolute certainty, but it was 10 or 11, yes.
Yeah, so we were a little bit more generous in terms of our, acceptance of whether a species was likely to hit New York or not. But that takes me into this piece of the presentation. So as Caroline mentioned in that question, we started out actually a couple of years ago at this point when Jenica was first generating these sort of initial lists for the range expanders tool with 100 species, which we didn't plan for it to be exactly 100, but it turned out to be exactly 100. So it's just a nice number to work with. So if you say, okay, you're in New York State or one of the other states of Southern New England where this list comes up and says, even, with just sort of like, moderate certainty, you're likely to have a whole bunch of new species that you've never seen before. And that's a real challenge for management, right? Because you don't know these species, you don't know what the best management practices are for these species, you may not even have seen these species before. And so what we wanted to try to do was to take this big list of 100 species and see if we can narrow that down into the ones that are most likely to be the most problematic of that set. And so what we did was to take this approach using a tool called ICAT. So this stands for, you can see at the bottom, the Environmental Impact Classification for Alien Taxa. So the nice thing about this particular protocol is that it was developed in Europe, so now about 4 or 5 years ago. It is a protocol that focuses only on impacts, so it doesn't focus on sort of other traits or characteristics of invasive species, but it's an extremely transparent approach to evaluating impact because it relies specifically on reading everything that you can find in the scientific literature that has tested the impact of that particular species. So it's fairly time intensive as far as an approach, but the real trade-off is that you get a very good sense of like what we know about the impacts of that species by looking at all of the literature. The other piece of that is that this whole ICAT scoring and analysis was done by May Rockwell Postel, who just graduated with her bachelor's degree from UMass earlier this year. So it is the type of thing that so someone with a bachelor's degree could be trained on. It's time intensive, but it's also doesn't require a PhD to go through it. So this involved reading titles and abstracts of peer-reviewed papers for all of those 100 species. And then May went through and looked at those to identify the ones that actually measured impacts. Next slide, thank you. So here's an example of a kind of summary for one of those range shifting species, which you also saw, I noticed it at the top of Jenica's list when she was just doing the demo too. So this one is one that we've got pretty high certainty will end up in New York. And the way to read this impact summary is basically the ICAT gets scored on a 1 to 4 level. So a 1 is a minimal impact, 2 moderate, or I forget what the things are even are. 1 minimal, concern, minor, moderate, major. They picked a whole bunch of M's just to like make your tongue not able to speak. 4 is a major impact. So a 4 means that from an ecological standpoint, this particular species in a scientific paper was reported to have an impact on an ecological community. So that is, it had a negative impact on richness, diversity, or evenness of the native community, or it had a negative impact in the populations of multiple species, so not just one. If you have a paper that looks at the impact on a single species and shows a negative impact on a single species population, that would give you a rank of 3. So the way to read this is that if you see a whole bunch of 4s, that means that lots of different studies for this particular species, Arundodonax. So Arundodonax is giant cane. This is a biofuel species that's actually been planted pretty widely down in Texas and Oklahoma. When it gets out into ecosystems, it wreaks havoc on riparian systems, so invades rivers, streams. It has also been implicated as a fire promoting species in all of those systems. So outcompetes native species, changes the physical structure of ecosystems, and also from an agricultural standpoint has been implicated as carrying diseases that can go into surrounding crops. So definitely one that we see as pretty bad. You can go to the next. And so all of that summary information for this particular species is backed up by a data sheet that has every single study that we found on Arundo-Donax listed out here with the journal source, the full citation, the text that we pulled out of the actual paper that supports that you know, this 1998 study had showed a major competitive impact on a native species. So that's the transparency of this. The nice thing about ICAT sort of relative to other assessments is that, so it's been recommended by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So that's, you know, sort of a global thing. One of the things that we really run into, at least in the Northeast, is that every state has its own kind of risk assessment. And even if you put the same species through multiple state risk assessments, you don't necessarily get like the same answer at the end of whether that's a high priority or medium priority species. The good thing about the ICAT assessment is because it's so transparent and all of the data are there and you can go and look at where this information came from, it's a little bit more, I would say, robust to you know, specific states or specific rules or something. You know, it's kind of going at a different level from any of the individual expert opinion based risk assessments that typically get used. Go to the next. So here's what we did. We had these 100 range shifting plants. May scanned about 14,000 titles and abstracts, and then identified 865 total papers from those. So yeah, like I said, it's a fair bit of work, but well worth it because now this database is there. So 67 of the 100, so a nice even 2/3, had at least 2 impacts related papers associated with them. The other third had 0 or 1 papers, and we decided that we needed to have at least 2 to feel at all confident about the impact scoring. So of those 67, we identified 9 as high priority. So these were species that had both at least 1 major ecological impact. So again, that's an impact on the ecological community, and also had some form of socioeconomic impact. So most of these were ones that were agriculturally related. So whether that was hosting some other pest or competing directly with crop species, those tended to be more common. But we also had human health impacts were possible in there, and other economic impacts, you know, on forestry or on power lines or something like that were also possible, although agriculture was the most common. We had 38 that were medium priority. So medium was scored as having either a major ecological impact or some form of socioeconomic impact. And then we had 17 that fell out as low priority, so we couldn't find any evidence in the literature of major ecological impacts, and there were no reported socioeconomic impacts. Next, please. So of those 9 that we had that showed up as these high priority, we took a kind of deeper dive into them because we wanted to be pretty confident that we're recommending species as high priority future species. Since New England was sort of our focal area, Southern New England and New York, we wanted to make sure that these species were actually ones that we think are going to be problematic in that area. So of the original 9, we actually cut that down to 4 really high impact species. And the other 5, some of them got excluded because we went back to those original papers and weren't convinced that they were really high impact. Some of them were excluded. We had a couple of tamarisk species that showed up in there, and tamarisk is one that's really problematic in semi-arid river systems, but we were less convinced that New England was really an area that that could be affected by it. As Jenica showed in the range expanders tool, one of the things you can do with that watch list is say, I'm only interested in species that are already in eastern temperate forests. So I didn't have that nice tool when we first made this list, but you can probably refine a little bit better now. So here are the 2 species that showed up, and I'll show you the next 2 in a second. So these are ones that could establish now and then expand across New England by 2050. So the red on here is high confidence that they could, so all of the areas you can see up in New England are pretty dark red for the water primrose, and definitely getting there in southern New England for the elm leaf blackberry. And so these are ones that are established now and expand by 2050. And then the next one are the ones that could establish by 2050. So this is more forward thinking, basically. So they're not necessarily ones that could establish now, but definitely could be here. We had a question earlier on about agricultural species. So the second one, the Avena barbata, is related to oats, right? So it outcompetes in California, especially a lot of grassland species, and then it's also closely related to cultivated oats, so it hosts crop pathogens. This is one where if you look at the distribution, we don't have reports on the East Coast, so it's possible that it's a lower likelihood of actually arriving in the Northeast. But given that it's a crop contaminant, those things can sometimes travel fast, so might still be one to look out for. Arundinodonax is that one that I mentioned before and showed you the summary slide for. This is that one that is really problematic as far as impacts on riparian systems. And I would say this one, of any of the ones that we've looked at, is one, so we had a question of suggesting that states try to prohibit invasive plants before they get there as preventative measures. And I would say absolutely that's something that we would definitely support. And this is an example of one that would be a really good candidate for that, because it's not yet suitable in the Northeast. It's strongly pushed as a biofuel. And so, but I think the negatives of it in terms of invading riparian areas and wetland systems are much worse than the potential benefits from biofuels. So it would definitely be one that if we can get it onto that list, any of our state lists or all of our state lists, then we would be in dealing with it much more proactively than not dealing with it. Okay. And we have one last slide, which is just our sort of summary. So as Jenica said at the beginning, we think that climate change is actually giving us a kind of unique opportunity to basically look ahead at what's coming. So where in the past, a lot of times, we don't know what's coming next. I mean, that's still true in the future, right? Because stuff is coming from overseas all the time. But at least in this case, we can look to the south and see the set of species that are invasive there now. We know they're invasive, and then look to see which of those are kind of the worst of the worst. So Jenica showed you all of those species maps, which are straight up on EdMaps now for 896 species that she modeled. So you can look through those and see where things are and likely to go. Here's that link again for the range shift listing tool and the impacts assessment. So there's a question also about how to get ICAT assessments that others have already done. And that's a really good question. So we are, for these 100 species, we've got that paper in revision right now. So we're revising it for the journal Biological Invasions, and we will publish our list of those, our assessment for those 100 species on UMass ScholarWorks, which is all open source. The IUCN is working on kind of trying to create a single repository in Europe, but they haven't quite gotten there yet. So we'll definitely, if we hear more about that, we'll update everyone. And then lastly, the ICAT template. So if you're interested in kind of what goes into it, that's also posted at the website at the bottom. You can find more about it on the RISC website as well, but we've put together some pretty extensive metadata to try to help through of our experiences doing the ICAT assessment. And I think the questions are next.
Great. And someone asked if we'll have links to, if these links will be sent out to you. And yes, when I send out a copy of the recording, there's also a link to the PowerPoints on there. So you'll be able to take the links from there. And actually we have one comment from Steve Young, who is our former director. And good to see you're here, Steve. And he says that Ludwia grandiflora specimens turned out to be L. hexapetala, so we don't have grandiflora in New York. And see the New York Flora Atlas. So that was
good. Then we can be even more proactive about
there you
it
go.
because it's just down the road in Maryland. So it seems like the kind of species that that also could.
Oh, and I got the wrong Steve Young. This is a Steve Young for the Natural Heritage Program. Well, you're welcome to that, Steve Young. So great. All right. Well, I think that is all the questions that we have. If someone else has one, just pop it up. And if you want to forward the slides, I know there's some pieces that I wanted to mention. One of them is that our RFA is due next Friday, the 15th. And so if you have a program that you would like to see funded, we do very small grants. This work was funded by 2 of these small grants, and we're always looking for good ideas. And so the deadline is next week. Also, we'd love to cross-pollinate in the region, and so we created this website called Find a Colleague, and we invite you to go there and post a profile about yourself and the kind of people that you would want to collaborate with. And if you want to go and look for a collaborator, you can go to that site. I don't know if Jenica and Bethany have put a profile up there, but hopefully they have, or they will. And then the archive of today's webinar is going to be available on demand. It usually takes us about a week to put that up. And I will send an email to everybody who is registered with a copy of the recording. And oh, and there's also a comment from John Peter. He says that Arundinodonax has been federally regulated in Canada. So I'll pass that along. And we also have a poll with some questions for you. And some of them are the same questions from the beginning to measure difference, and a couple of different questions for you. So if you could answer those questions, and then we will share the results at the end. Oh, and this looks like the wrong set of questions. Okay, well, let's just end that poll. That is kind of odd. Okay, all right, I think I must have fluffed that up somehow. And maybe try, okay, I'm just going to, all right, we will, okay, I think I have just made a mistake there, and we will just move right along. So, okay, so thank you very much, Jenica, and thank you, Bethany. What I will do actually probably is put that those polling questions into a Qualtrics report, or into a Qualtrics, and I'll send that out to everybody. So, so if you could just take a couple of minutes to do that, that would be a good way for us to collect some evaluation data. And with that, I will say thank you very much to Jenica for your time. Thank you, Bethany, for your time and your expertise and your generous sharing it with us. And feel free to follow up with Jenica and Bethany if you have any more questions. And yeah, and Elizabeth, I'll give the last word to Elizabeth Christfeld. She said that was an awesome presentation, and I'm so impressed with this newly available information. So there you go. That'll take you through the rest of your afternoon.
Very good.
So, thanks, everybody. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.